Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our KPMG and nsKnox joint webinar. My name is Tal, and I'll be your moderator today. In the next hour or so, we're going to discuss the changes that were imposed on all of us, given the evolving reality, how it affected the corporate payment world processes, heightened fraud rate, and what we should do in order to protect corporate payment in the new reality. First off, please allow me to introduce our speakers today. Israel Aloni, Director of Cybersecurity at KPMG, and the Global Lead for the Secure Payments Joint Solution with nsKnox. Israel has over 20 years of experience in the technology industry. From nsKnox, I'm happy to introduce you to Alan Schieber. He serves as the CDO at nsKnox. Alan is a recognized expert in today's B2B payment system and corporate payment procedures. Prior to joining nsKnox, Alan led development at HP and Symantec. One last piece of information about today's webinar. We will hold a Q&A session at the end. Kindly hold on to your questions until then. Israel, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you, Tal, and hello, everyone. Great to be here today. I think a key question that I think all of us are dealing with is basically, whether it's personally or professionally, is basically, when are we going to get our lives back? When this entire thing will be over and we will go back to normal the way it used to be? And I think the honest and realistic answer is not anytime soon. Sorry, we had an issue here with the slides. Apologies. Apologies for that. And the reason I'm saying that is that, first off, in most of the countries, the first wave of the pandemic is still here. Yes, in some of the countries, it started subsiding down, but not over yet. Some countries are still feeling it full force. So it's here. And this represents itself in lockdown, social distancing, very limited public transportation, and practically almost zero international travels. Further, even as government in countries that may have got hit and got over it earlier than others, even as government started lifting off restrictions, we are seeing a lot of companies, employees, schools, still further restricting themselves. Companies deciding that they will keep on working from home the entire summer, allowing their employees the choice to decide, etc. And also, I think in many places, we're still preparing for a second wave. Part of it is a mini second wave. For example, where I'm based, in the first few months, the government has been very effective in kind of getting control over the pandemic. And as a result, with positive kind of trends down, a few weeks ago started lifting up restrictions and allowing kids to go back to school. Unfortunately, we have already seen a little bit of regression there with localized infections in some schools. So now the government has basically paused any further relaxation and in fact is considering going back. So this might happen in other places as well. Obviously, we don't really understand that pandemic well enough yet. And of course, the big second wave everyone is concerned about is the next winter. Will we have vaccination by then? Will we understand the virus enough by then? So all things considered, I think our view at KPMG, and we're definitely not alone in that view, is that rather than expecting to go back to the normal the way it used to be, we need to accept a new reality and a new normal that we need to operate with, live in, work at. And in that context and in that frame of mind, we are going to talk today about supplier payment fraud. Now, to be clear, supplier payment fraud was here before the coronavirus. Supplier payment fraud happens when companies think that they are paying their suppliers for products or services, but actually because of a fraud scheme, the money is routed somewhere else. First off, dealing with business transactions means that every single hit when it happens could be quite substantial, and it's not unusual for such fraud cases to hit hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of dollars in a single transaction. What maybe is less known is that this is also a very big problem in aggregate. In fact, it has been so substantial that the FBI and the SEC has been tracking it for several years now. And the recent estimate is that is a 25 billion plus total aggregated fraud market, if you will, or fraud problem in the last 3 years. And in fact, if you look at the reports they issued year after year, we are seeing that the problem is doubling itself globally every 1 or 2 years. So it was a big problem already. It was a growing problem already. One of the other unique attributes of it is how broadly applicable it is. I'm a cyber professional, and normally when we consider our other cyber or fraud problems, we would ask ourselves, why that victim? Why that target? What sensitive data do they have that an attacker would be interested in? Here, it's a much simpler game. Your company is large enough, you pay your suppliers, you have money, that's it, you're a target. And the statistics actually support that claim. Essentially, we're seeing that most, if not all, large companies get hit with those attempts, and it's just a matter of some of those attempts to go through to make the fraudsters very profitable. The other unique attribute of that type of fraud is how many different vectors could be used to materialize and to commit such fraud. This could be external attackers using relatively simple means such as social engineering, basically well-crafted emails pretending to be your suppliers, but they could be more sophisticated. For example, hack the email account of either the paying customer or the supplier before intercepting an email about a specific transaction, and then send a much more convincing social engineering email. We've also seen, hardcore cyber attacks enabling this, whether it's keylogging malware, stealing credentials of key employees in finance and procurement and IT, and then logging in on their behalf to ERP, or malware variants developed specifically to target ERP systems and exploit their vulnerabilities. Last but not least, insider fraud, which is generally a serious problem, is also very relevant here, where people with the right knowledge, the right access could essentially bypass the controls of the organization. So this was a big problem before the coronavirus. It was a growing problem, a problem that impacts many companies out there, and that can come in many different forms and appearances. And attack statistics actually support that. There are many, many companies with highly publicized cases, very substantial amounts, as you can see. And it almost doesn't matter, again, which industry or country you're at. It's just a matter of exposure. And as the bare fact of those stories making their ways to the news tell you, it's not just the monetary loss, it's also the very bad PR and essentially loss of trust in your company. Now, all of that happened before, but still we are here today to focus on what changed with COVID-19. So I'll start with a high-level observation and then get into the details. If you think about all of you, irrespective of which country you're at, which company, which city and state, all of us have been bombarded with so many changes over the last 2 to 3 months. And those changes mean that what good looks like, how the legitimate employees work, but also how bad looks like, which techniques the attackers are taking. So many changes to good and to bad essentially mean that whatever assumptions and models and controls and baselines we had yesterday to detect and prevent fraud might no longer be valid. And that makes it obviously much harder to detect and prevent that fraud. At the same time, at the personal level, we are, as I said, we have been bombarded with so many changes in what's required of us, sometimes every week or day, that my concern is that we might have become, got to the point, of change fatigue, where we are less alert to changes, we're less suspicious when changes occur, because constant changes have become our new normal. So that's a high-level observation, again, of how challenging it is in that changing reality to detect and prevent fraud. And I want to take the next few moments to go into individual and specific changes that have happened over the last 2 to 3 months and relate those to supplier payment fraud in particular. So first, how do we work with our suppliers? I mean, key factors come to mind when you analyze it. First off, what do you buy and from whom and from where? Do you import those or are they domestic? How do you interact with your suppliers? How do you pay your suppliers? And also, how do you get all the approvals and reviews done internally within your company before you go and pay the supplier? Now, all of that obviously was here for a long time. Like as long as we go back in history, when commerce was there, you had to buy from someone, you had to pay them, you had to interact with them, and you had to have your tribal, or company boss to approve. But clearly the internet era with email, with e-commerce, with B2B and B2C portals and sites provided a dramatic boost to how we do this, to the reach, to the scale, to the digital factors. But more importantly for our session today, the new normal together with and post-COVID-19 is essentially driving a very extreme and very accelerated digitalization of those. I mean, if you think about it, there is a fluctuation of who you buy from and what you buy from them. We are clearly now moving from somewhat digital or pretty digital when we interact with our suppliers to almost entirely digital interactions with supplier. I mean, think of it. We're not going to conferences because there aren't. We're not flying anywhere. We barely go to face-to-face meeting with our suppliers, and very few countries allow that now to begin with. Same applies to payments. Already before the pandemic, a lot of companies were considering how to move from checks to electronic payments. But that has now been accelerated. I can tell you both at KPMG internally, as well as many conversations I'm having with clients, more and more I'm hearing stories about, hey, that digital transformation project that we planned for 2 years, we have ended up doing it now in 2 weeks or 2 months. Whether it's video conferencing, cloud portals, electronic payments, digital signature of documents, what have you. What we plan to do very slowly, we have now done very, very quickly. And same also applies to internal approval workflows. Before the pandemic, we were all going into office, and yes, some of the approvals might have been via email, but a lot of them have been going to the room next door, asking your boss to sign on a piece of paper and document that, or make a phone call to make sure everything is okay. Since now most or all of us are working from home, and same applies for our colleagues and managers, a lot of the approval workflows within companies have become digital as well. Now, none of that should come as a surprise to people on the call. I mean, I'm sure I'm describing a work reality that all of you have experienced, the same as I did in the last few months. But the more important point I want to make here is that as we have gone through that extreme and accelerated digital transformation, with all the good things it enabled, it also increased our exposure to fraud risk. And that's a big issue. Now, to be fair, we had to rush it. And when I say we, I generally talk about all of our companies, right? Organizations, when the pandemic broke, have rightfully focused on their bare business survival. And in that case, core business functions, core IT functions, be able to get any work done, be able to pay salaries was the key things. Everything else was, backseat. And in such a rush change, focused on survival, some risks had to be accepted, and that's okay from risk management perspective. Some controls had to be relaxed. Some controls that were previously very centralized have now become distributed simply because all of us work from home. A lot of IT controls that were centralized in the perimeter, in the network, have now shifted to the endpoints we use at home. Some of those are corporate issued laptops, and some of them might be our personal computers that we also use to connect via VPN. So while that was needed and justified and made a lot of sense, now, 3 months into it, after most of our companies have done the urgent stuff already, allow Zoom meetings, for example, allow VPN to people who didn't need it before. And also now that we realize that the new normal is here to stay, it is also the time, that's our view, to go back and adapt and tighten the risk controls to that new normal. Maybe not to what it was before, but to the new normal. Now, interestingly, we talk about supplier payments fraud, and one of the key changes and most intense changes that happened recently is the actual supply chain itself. Think about your company. I'm sure, like many others, that you are buying now products and services you didn't buy before because you never needed them. All kinds of hygiene and health products to allow opening the office, for example. At the same time, there are many things you have bought quite a bit before and you don't buy now, for example, because no one is traveling. Surely, there are struggling suppliers out there that might have gone out of business, forcing their clients to find substitutes very quickly. Or maybe I'm talking about an international supplier with isolation as far as air travel goes, and maritime shipping is very, very slow. So I had to find some temporal replacement domestically because I cannot rely right now on that supplier. And it could just be a cost reduction. Pretty much every company I know of have recently tried to look at how we cut costs, and part of that could be moving to lower cost suppliers. So that's a bigger business situation, but the implication of that to your procurement and accounts payable team is that in a relatively short time, they're getting much higher than usual workload of supplier onboarding, supplier management, supplier updates, supplier reviews that they need to go through. And the concern is that with so much changes needing to be handled, while we change the way we work and the IT environment that we work in, that reality, that combined reality might not allow those teams to have enough time and attention required to do the proper due diligence you would expect them to do normally when they onboard or change suppliers. So that supply chain intensive change might be impacting negatively the due diligence we apply to managing those suppliers. Another very different aspect, which I alluded to earlier and unfortunately is on the rise, is insider fraud. Always an issue, always impacting supplier payment fraud. Quite a bit of that happens through that vector. But specifically to the new normal and the COVID-19 impact, many companies had to go through payment cuts, sending some of their workforce to unpaid time off, sometimes all of their workforce, or maybe even restructuring and layoffs. And that's at the micro level. At the macro level, many countries and economies are obviously concerned about how the next 12 months are going to look like, and are we entering or have we already entered the downturn period? All of that means that for the impacted individuals, they are going through personal financial stress right now. And whether we like it or not, some of them will have negative emotions. Why was it me that got laid off? Why not the guy next door, which I know I'm performing better than him at the office? Why me? And that negative emotion that some employees, rightly so or not, might feel, combined with the personal financial stress they are at right now, combined with the relaxed controls that temporarily make it easier to commit fraud, all of that increases our risk. I mean, ask yourself a simple question. How many recently restructured employees are out there who just got laid off maybe 1 week ago and still have credentials that could still be used internally in the company because no one bothered to revoke those credentials? I'm quite sure there are many companies out there with that problem right now as we speak. Another personal or human aspect of it, and a very different one, is the psychological conditioning all of us got into in the last few months. And I'm specifically talking about how easily and how frequently we share personal data. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm married, I have kids, I work. I think on average, I'm signing 6 to 7 health declarations every day. Part of it is for my kids before I send them to school. Part of it is when I get to the office, my company is required to require me to do this. Part of it when I go to certain shops and they don't just check my temperature at the entrance, but they also have me sign a declaration. We all increased our online shopping, even basic stuff like grocery, especially in lockdown areas and periods. Individuals that are now unemployed might be going online to government websites to subscribe for financial aid and unemployment refunds and such, and similarly for companies. All in all, if you look at the average daily share of personal data and sensitive logins with credentials compared to what it was 3-4 months ago, it's 3 times more or 4 times more. And as always happens, when we do something a lot, we become less sensitive to it. Add to that the fact that in many countries, even if at different levels, privacy was temporarily deprioritized to some extent to allow governments and health bodies and ministries of health to track the pandemic spread, right? Whether it's centralized or local on your phone, you know, a mobile app to track location and such. Privacy is important, but temporarily some sacrifices are accepted in some countries. All of that means that we're less alert when we share personal data, and that makes us more susceptible to fall victim to phishing and scams. And of course, you can trust fraudsters to be happily and eagerly and expertly waiting exactly for that to happen. At KPMG, we have a global cyber task force that track threats that emerge around the world and basically provide a unified threat intelligence feed for all of us to be able to help our customers better. And that ongoing tracking have shown us double and sometimes even triple-digit increase in certain types of attacks, whether it's fake websites and web domains with the corona word in them, just exploiting the fact that people are naturally interested in news about us and updates, a very dramatic increase in phishing attacks, and also, unfortunately, on the unsuspecting victim side, much higher, in fact, as high as 5x more a higher likelihood of unsuspecting users to click on malicious link. Let me give you one interesting piece of data that literally came in this morning. One of the more interesting trends that we have spotted in the last week or two was that fraudsters are specifically increasing phishing efforts who target employees who just laid off. Basically, they monitor which company publicized that it had layoffs, or it's in the social media, and then they find out who are the employees of that company and conduct targeted phishing campaigns against employees who just got laid off or might have gotten laid off. And the motivation there is to try and grab credentials, username and passwords that might still be relevant and allow the attackers to go and hack into the companies, the very same companies that laid those people off. So that tells you how sophisticated fraudsters are. And look, we might despise them for what they do, but as a professional appreciating other professionals, I think we have to give them the credit for what they are good at. They are really, really good at identifying changing circumstances and adapting to those. And my view is that if we want to seriously fight and win them, we should have some of that as well. So to recap what we discussed as far as how the COVID-19 and the expected new normal is impacting supplier payment fraud risk in particular, here are the things we discussed. The accelerated digitalization is great in many ways, but it also increases our exposure to fraud. All of us having gone through business survival mode means that some controls were relaxed, and now is the time to maybe tighten them back. The quite intense supply chain changes in many companies on both sides of it means that it's harder to apply the proper and required due diligence when we check new suppliers. The personal financial stress due to employment changes might increase the insider fraud case. Sharing so much sensitive data online because we have to, or because we are required to, or because we need to, makes us less alert and more susceptible to fraud and phishing scams. And lastly, there are the fraudsters who happily exploit all that. So far on the impact, a very significant impact, I would say, to a problem which again was very substantial to begin with. And that is probably a good segue to hand it over to Ellen, my colleague, to discuss what can we actually do about that and how we can try and make it better. So over to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Israel, for the crystal clear description of the new challenges we're facing today. Now let's see what we can do about it. So Corporate payments, and not to mention procure to pay, are a complex process to begin with. It crosses the whole organization and involves procurement, accounting, treasury, and other groups. It involves different systems and different interfaces inside the organization and outside of the organization. So rarely there is one person that sees the whole picture. When we talk with IT, then they will tell us about firewalls, identity management, and email scanners. When we talk with accounting, then they will see their accounting procedures and so on. And these silos are exactly what fraudsters are after. It makes it so much easier for them to slip between the cracks and to manipulate the process. And now with social distancing and work from home, these silos are even further apart, which means that it's a greater opportunity for fraudsters. So what can we do to protect our payments process? Now, it turns out that a problem with multiple layers requires a solution with multiple layers. So the first thing to do would be to recognize that you need to work together with your CIO or with your CISO. They are the experts of technology, while you are the expert in the business process. And that's a gap that you need to bridge. So gather all the people that take part in the process, treasury, accounting, accounts payable, and sit with your IT. Review together the details of the whole process. Which parties participate, which system do they use, and most importantly, how handovers between one party to the other and between one system to the other are done. Is it emails, maybe files exchange, or maybe something else? Today, it's not a technical session, but that meeting with your IT should be. Your IT expert will tell you whether your team members, the ones that work from home, need to harden the laptops or install an MDM on their mobile devices, maybe start using multi-factor authentication or communicate via VPN, or a long list of other things. Now, that's a good first step, but as the FBI director once said, there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. So by all means, that's not enough. The second thing to take care of is people and processes. You should review your existing controls and search for these interfaces between people or interfaces between systems. These are the points that might need to change. Let's take, for example, reviewing the interface with a bank. Now, that's a great example because everybody is working with a bank. So you can contact your bank and communicate new emergency numbers. It might be that the current emergency numbers are not relevant anymore because people are working from home and cannot be reached at the office. Another thing to do would be to limit the number of people that are authorized to communicate with the bank to the bare minimum possible. Also, you should consider sending these people a special hardened laptop and tell them to use only that machine to access the bank portal. So this is only one example of an interface and a few simple steps that you can do. I'm sure that if you'll think about it, you will find many more such interfaces in your company and apply these procedures to them. Another good practice would be not to rush, at least after a sensitive change is applied to the system. For example, you might consider blocking payments to an account that was just modified, at least for a few days. This simple step will eliminate many types of internal fraud and external fraud. The next thing to do would be to educate and to train your employees. Refresh their memory with existing controls and explain the new ones. Now, the next one, and that's very important, maybe these are two things. Try to standardize and centralize as much as possible. Standardization means that there is only one method to do things, only one channel to issue payments, only one channel to onboard suppliers, and so on. Now, of course, this is not always possible. It might be that the plant uses one type of payment method, while the headquarters uses another. However, you should try to achieve it as much as you can. And hand in hand with standardizations comes centralization. Centralization means that only a handful of trained people do these things. For example, a specialized master data team that is the sole updater of your vendor's master data file. And that's just one example. This way, by centralizing as much as possible, it is easier to track activity. It is easier to control processes, and it is much more easier to apply changes whenever required. Now, last but not least, and that's something that we are all aware of, but not always follow, segregation of duties. No single person should have more than one leg in the payment process, and try to be as methodic as possible. For example, try to pull your ERP users list and A, ensure that all logged users are private and belong to real people, and B, review their authorizations to ensure that no user can complete a payment process step alone. This will shrink those gaps enhanced by COVID-19 and reestablish that lost baseline that Israel mentioned before. But keep in mind that all these steps are only manual procedures, and sooner or later, someone will make a mistake. Someone will be forced to cut corners, and that could not end well. So to fully protect those critical payment processes and to ensure that it won't happen that the CFO of the company will wake up one morning, discover that millions of dollars just disappeared from one of his company's bank accounts, you need to do more than that. You need to do more than just protecting your infrastructure. You need to do more than just protecting people and processes. You need to take an end-to-end approach. You need to address both things that fraudsters are after. And this would be A, an input to the process, or all the input to the process, meaning that bank account that you add to your vendor's master data or change in your master data. And B, the output of the system, meaning the payments that are sent to the bank. So when we designed the secure payment service, we had these 2 points in mind. Now let's take a closer look at the secure payment service. It is composed of 2 major modules. One of the modules takes care of the very first thing in the process itself. It takes care of validating the vendor bank account ownership. And this module provides a much smarter method to do that validation. And when saying a much smarter method, I mean that it allows you to validate the vendor bank account details without exchanging documents with your vendor. And thinking of that, these documents are only digital pictures and they are very easy to falsify. It also provides you a method to validate the ownership of the bank account without making those phone calls, which are extremely difficult to track and very easy to be confused. Actually, while using this module, you don't have to rely on any piece of information that comes from your vendor. And that's a good thing because your vendor or your alleged vendor is the person who makes the claim that this bank account belongs to him. So it won't be a good idea to rely only on him as a source of information. Instead, this module provides you a source of information that is gathered from external, independent, and very trusted third parties that can ensure that the bank account really belongs to whom you think that it belongs. You can think of it as a title company for bank account ownership. Just like when you buy a new property, you won't ask the person who allegedly owned that property whether this property is his. You will go to a title company and check that out. And in the same sense, this module is that title company for bank account ownership. Also, this module is able to validate the ownership of both international and domestic accounts. And that's important because we noticed that fraudsters are usually after international bank accounts. And that's probably because it's much easier to validate the ownership information of someone who lives next door than to do the same for someone in China or in Japan. And that's because of the time zone difference, the language barrier, and so on. So all in all, by using this module, you'll protect your teams and your processes from social engineering. Because if someone pretends to be your supplier, he will not give you a bank account that really belongs to that supplier. It will give you a bank account that belongs to someone else. And by using that technology, you can systematically identify these attempts for fraud. Now, the second module takes care of the last step of the process, the payment instructions themselves. It does that by ensuring that every payment that you are sending to the bank goes to a beneficiary account that was previously validated by the first module. And by doing that, you're also protecting your company from insider fraud and from a cyber attack. Because if an insider tries to create fictitious vendors and fictitious bank accounts, these bank accounts will pop up during the payment. So the system will identify an unknown bank account and either alert on that or stop the payment altogether. And the same goes for cyber attacks, for example, that try to manipulate the payment file that you are creating. Now, these two modules together provide an end-to-end solution for the whole payment process. And also with that, you can utilize KPMG's know-how of payment processes. You will be able to work with our partners at KPMG to review your existing payment processes and to identify potential vulnerabilities and also identify opportunities to make them more efficient. So the whole package together is called secure payments. All in all, the major benefits of using secure payments is, first of all, preventing all major fraud types, meaning social engineering, insider fraud, and cyber attacks. You will also gain more visibility to your process because everything is traceable. There is no option to do things under the hood. You will also gain central control in case you have several systems or your operation is distributed. You will be able to do that from a central location. And the bottom line is that you will also gain operational efficiency, because not only that you'll be able to introduce new controls that you don't have today, you will also be able to automate part of the existing ones, and by that, saving the time of your team so they will be able to do other important things. So to sum things up, we all know that it's a good practice, at least when it comes to fraud prevention, to trust, yet to verify. An end-to-end solution will enable you to replace trusting that everything is okay with knowing that everything is okay, which is a very big difference. Now with that, I want to return the control back to our moderator, to Tal.
Thank you so much, Israel and Alan, for this presentation. Now we would like to take your questions. Please use the Q&A tab on your screen to post your questions. Okay, we got the first question in. Okay, statistically, what are the chances you could validate an account?
Well, I will take this question. Up till now, the system was able to validate all the bank accounts that it was required, so the answer would be 100%.
All right. Another question is, what IT measures would I have to take in order to implement your solution?
I will take this question as well. So the system itself has two flavors. The first flavor is non-integrated, meaning that it doesn't require any integration with ERP systems or payment systems. So the amount of IT effort is close to zero. Also, there is an option to integrate the system with a major ERP system, SAP, Oracle, and a list of others. In this case, it would require some IT effort. This is not a huge task, but still this is a change to the ERP, so it always involves QAing and testing. So there are two options here.
All right. Okay, I see another question. How long does it take to validate an account?
Well, usually it depends. So some accounts may be validated immediately. in a fraction of a second. Other accounts, it might take 24 to 48 hours to do that. What our customers are usually doing is to start the validation process right when they start the interaction with the supplier. So until they get to the point that they need to actually add it to their ERP system, then the information is already there.
Got it. All right. Okay, here's an interesting one. If you were to choose between all the different precautions that are needed to be taken, what's the first thing you would do?
Yeah, Ellen, I can take that if that's okay. So as much as we want to apply solutions, the very first thing I would recommend companies to go through is assessing where they are. It's not instead of implementing a solution, it's actually to enable a smart and informed implementation of a solution. And by assessment, I mean the following, and that's an exercise we do quite a bit with our customers. Look at your current processes, especially the one that Alan mentioned in his review of the solution, and your controls today in place for those solutions, and try to identify the weak points where someone could compromise those controls and processes. Now, that's easier said than done. This is not criticisms, but many customers we talk to are maybe limited by a failure to imagine what an attacker would do. And so the way we help there to assess how effective those controls could really be is to come up with a matrix or a list of fraud scenarios that could result and are known to be possible to result with in a supplier payment fraud, and do a matrix check of that list of scenarios against the controls that customers have. This could be a theoretical review, but it could also be a simulated test review, and therefore bringing this fresh perspective of an attacker to try and circumvent the controls they have in place, we are able to pinpoint specific weak points, and we know that those are the places in the process where it would make sense to implement or integrate the capabilities of solutions.
Yes, maybe one point that I would like to add is that the immediate suspect in these cases would be any interface, any handover, and especially if that's a handover between two systems and maybe a handover between one system within the organization and another system outside of the organization. Just like that simple bank account or simple bank interaction, bank interface that I went through during the presentation.
Okay. Are you able to guarantee payments cannot be intercepted, copied, redirected in transit? If so, how?
Well, I'll take it, Israel.
Sure.
So the system itself doesn't perform the actual payment, meaning it doesn't require that you will change something in the method that you are performing your payments. If you are doing a host-to-host payment, then you will continue to do that. If you're doing SWIFT, then you'll continue to do that. So this is not something that is immediately part of the system, but what we have seen that most of the problems happen in the interface, meaning in the data that is entered into the system, the method, the content of the payment file itself, and this is where we are.
Yeah, Alan, I'd like to add to that. I think just to dovetail what you just said. I think what we've realized that as important as the electronic transfer, e.g. the instructions to the bank is, and it is, I think most companies have got that piece covered already, most of them by using encrypted channels of transmitting the file or the instruction to the bank or the clearinghouse, etc. Where we have found most failures and most issues is on the paying customer side, and that's where usually controls fail, and this is why the solution focus on that. Now, it's worth mentioning, not to get too technical, but for whatever controls the solution is providing to the paying customer side, data during that, whether it's the validated suppliers data, the checked payments data, etc., is actually protected by a very unique data protection technology that actually splits secrets to multiple different locations, so that there is no single point of possible failure or compromise to tamper with the data on the customer side. So we are really trying to bolster and harden the data until the very last moment that it leaves the company on its way to the clearinghouse or the bank. And of course, the recommendation and the assumption is that the actual transmission is done via secured encrypted channels already. And if not, then you should do ASAP. Any other questions we have, Tal?
No, I don't see any other questions. This is the time. If you have a question, please submit it. So if we don't have any more questions, thank you all for joining the webinar today. We really hope that you find it practical, interesting, and remember that we're always here to assist with any questions and inquiries. Feel free to reach out to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.